So
Hi,
apologies to,
everyone.
yeah, hi. Apologies to everybody here. We just had a few technical difficulties, and so we are ready to begin. So thank you so much for joining, Making Your Money Green. We are here, and I'm excited to be able to finally talk about one of my most passionate topics. And I really want to start allowing you, our guests, to start to understand more about the area. So today is about aligning your investment goals with fighting climate change. It's a really big topic, dear to my heart. So today we're going to try to keep it pretty tight. We're going to try to give you some of the main basic areas, and we are going to focus on some alternative energy sources that our guests have been able to actually take advantage of and help add value in your client portfolios. So why don't we start with some housekeeping items? And Alicia, do you want to just have a brief explanation of that?
Great. Thank you, Serena. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, please note some of our housekeeping rules today on WebEx. Today's call will be approximately 30 minutes with a brief Q&A toward the end of the call. Please kindly note that this call is being recorded. Your lines have been muted and will remain so throughout the call. For our Q&A portion, we welcome you to submit your questions via the chat or Q&A function at the bottom screen of your WebEx screen. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Serena.
Thank you. So first, I wanted to reiterate here, there's a lot of people who've come together today to help us talk about this initiative, and I want to thank all of you and the people behind getting everything ready to our panelists. So if I can start with the introductions, I'd like to introduce Martin Grosskopf. Martin Grosskopf is a very, very long time friend, colleague, and expert in the field that I have followed for years, even before he and I had connected. He's got decades of experience in the financial area as well as environmental analysis. I'll look forward to him explaining that to us. He's got all sorts of accolades, including, he's one of the lead individuals in ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance issues. So you've probably seen him all over the place when we're talking about these kind of issues, as he really is known as a global leader in the space. Equally as interesting and knowledgeable is John Cook. So John Cook, thank you so much for attending today. And he is here through audio. We did have some technical challenges. He started off with an incredible company called Greenchip, which in its name implies exactly what he is passionate about. One of Canada's very largest innovation hubs. He had started as well and was leading. And that mutual fund company that he now has become a part of is an extremely great partner for us today. And with that, I want to also end with Max. Max Zert is also somebody who we're going to be able to count on for some words of wisdom. And Max comes from more the social governance side. So he is an expert foremost in working collaboratively to make sure that we as investors are able to be aligned with understanding the environment of what it is to invest in these areas, so that we as investors can have a better understanding of what actually is doing what it says it does in this space. I think you all probably are aware, just like me, when you see something on a label that's selling to you something, it's questionable and you wonder what that's all about. So really at the end of the day, that's what Max does. He's trying to distill it down for us so that we actually have a way to put everybody on an equal field, and we can then measure who's really being effective and who's not. So let's begin today. And as Alicia said, it is going to be pretty tight. We're not looking to make this a lengthy call, but I have some really important parts to start. The IPCC. So our panelists are very familiar with it, but let me just explain to all of you. It's an intergovernmental body of the United Nations. What it does, it's an organization that is responsible to advance the knowledge for human inducing climate change. And so what is climate change and all the challenges that we've had? Well, it's been pretty scary, and I'd really love to be able to have Martin talk a little bit about that shortly. And as we begin, Martin, if you could just talk a little bit about what is it that's been happening in the global warming front that we should be really worried about? And then also, do you mind telling us in this last year when COVID shut down the world, how that actually affected those emissions numbers and the trajectory that we saw?
Sure, Serena, thanks. And welcome everybody. Thank you for your time. You can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Caught you while you were drinking there. Yeah, so I think to put it in context, I mean, we've been on a obviously growing trajectory of emissions over a very long period of time. There's a very strong correlation between GDP growth and emissions generally in the world. There's been some efficiencies that have improved, the global footprint, at least in the developed world. But really, it took last year to make a big dent in the emissions trajectory, right? So last year, everybody shut down. Obviously, we weren't going to work. We changed our behavior dramatically, and that provided a reprieve of, let's say, 7-8% in terms of the overall emissions.
That
But
seems huge. That's
yeah,
huge, right?
that's big. I mean, that's
Like,
basically larger than the Great Financial Crisis, which was a
wow.
massive recession.
So when you
Uh,
said like changing people, like what did you do? Like what happened? Did you find like suddenly you weren't driving as much or?
well, I mean, clearly, I'm already on the bike most of the time, so my use of transportation didn't change that much, to be quite honest with you. But I think for most people, yeah, that not going to work, and I think my carbon footprint associated with business travel went to zero. That's
Right.
huge, huge.
Right. So you
Um,
were probably traveling a lot right before that.
yeah, I mean, we were going to meetings, as an example, outside of London for an hour, by plane.
Right.
Um, and because an investment committee would say, hey, we want to see you, and then you'd be flying back like the next day, on the early flight. So
Right.
those emissions all went to zero. And
Yeah.
the only problem is that as soon as we get back into growth mode, as soon as we go back to normality, those emissions come back very strongly, right? So this year
Yeah.
we're seeing acceleration again. And so it really was a reprieve, but it was an example, I think, of what's possible just under more draconian, scenario, which
Yeah.
obviously we don't
Yeah.
want. We want to
Right.
avoid that scenario.
Yeah.
But the latest reports, from the UN as an example, just put it in context of a 20 to 25-year trajectory of reports from the UN that have identified human-induced global warming as an issue. Now the latest report is just much more emphatic that the science is completely indisputable, right? 20 years
Yeah.
ago, people said, well, maybe Al Gore came out with a nice presentation that said for sure, but people didn't really take it too seriously. Scientists
Mhm.
are 98, 99% convinced that it's human-induced global warming. And
Right.
so we're now at the point of either make or break in terms of policy decisions to, to deal with that longer term.
Yeah. And John, if I can just connect with you for a moment. I mean, we were talking about this on our practice run, and you had mentioned something about a tree, and I just can't get over the amount of extreme weather that we've increasingly been experiencing. Can you maybe kind of connect that in your life with respect to what's been happening in this? In climate change?
Sure. And everyone can hear me as well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, what I was suggesting about the tree, so we have a farm that I've been going to my entire life, and we've actually lost 2 tree species in my lifetime, which is, there's a lot of different types of trees, but first it was the Dutch elm disease, which wasn't really related, it was related more to, importing of a bug. But more recently, we've had this emerald ash borer, which has been killing off all the white ash. And we've got an entire forest on our farm that literally is just, all the ash are just falling over anytime there's a windstorm. And it's just amazing to think that, this change in the climate, which traditionally would have killed off this bug, is wiping out an entire species of trees, and it's not going to come back. It's gone.
That's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's really funny. Every single one of us has a story about, how they're being affected. And that's a sad one. And I'm so sorry. And I can't even imagine how heartbreaking that is when you've been, on your property for that many years, right? It's probably was just lovely to look out at. And
Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, maybe if I could just follow on what Martin was saying, is I know we agree totally on this. The connection to the investment world is to grow the economy in the future, which has been historically so linked to emissions, because most emissions, 80% of them, come from the burning of fossil fuels, is to invest in alternative sources of energy and energy efficiency technologies that allow us to produce the same things with less energy inputs. And to me, that all comes back to capital investment, which is where this problem and the solution to it ties to investment activity. And just if I could put a figure on it, we think it's somewhere around $2.5 trillion a year annually that needs to be invested in these solutions if we're going to get to a more sustainable future, one that doesn't have the emissions profile that we currently have. And we're currently investing about $800 billion a year. So there's that $1.7 trillion a year gap that is the difference between an economic future for our children and one that looks pretty grim.
yeah, well, it is really frightening to me when I look at it. And Max, how do we get there? You're in charge of helping us as like layman individuals. How much is poured in there? A lot, though. I mean, at least it is that kind of amounts we're looking at, but clearly there's quite a way for us to go. So Max, like when you're talking about governance and helping us, like what are you doing to help us, and how do we access this information? Because I think there's lots of us who are like, we're looking around constantly and wondering if what for example, a Martin says is actually, and he's actually investing in the companies that are making a difference. I think a lot of our clients do end up relying on us, but at the end of the day, I'm always trying to empower our clients to themselves have kind of an understanding. So if you could just let us know a little bit about that, and then also maybe connect it to something that's happening in your life.
Difficult to connect it. I will say, during this pandemic, we introduced a new family member, so we had a little quarantini. So that really took up the most effort, and really kind of took us on. My eldest did learn how to bike, as the panelists are all bikers as well. That is one of my joys in life. So that's something we do a lot.
Yeah.
From our end, from my end, I really look, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, is just seeing how companies are kind of behaving, but also tracking and understanding what risks are out there. And, I started back in 2007 in the space, and, there was really no regulatory oversight or regime in terms of kind of determining, what are the standardized approach of measuring climate risk, right? And so that's kind of, first of all, it's branched off of the ESG. You made the environment, social, and governance introduction. I would say climate has really kind of taken on its own approach. So it's not just underlining the E, it's really kind of separate to the E as a whole. And so, by that nature, you really have to look at it through a different lens.
Right.
And there are actually hundreds of frameworks out there to report upon by companies and investors. But what came about, only within the last few years has been this recommendation that was started by Mark Carney, chaired by Michael Bloomberg, and big names backing it as well, is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And the TCFD is just driving, and I think you and your clients and others are going to hear about TCFD much more.
Okay.
The traction has been incredible, and countries are now pushing that on. And just last week, actually, Canada, the regulators have proposed to make climate risk reporting mandatory in line with TCFD.
Well, that's really huge, and that's probably one of the reasons why we, as investors in this space, we're able to then be able to count on information like that, right? I mean, they're actually going to be required and responsible for being, I guess, positive to the initiative. And
Yeah.
so when I look at decarbonizing the community, okay, and the economy, it's obviously an incredibly important movement in our industry. And I think the net zero emissions first, Martin, can you just talk, getting to net zero emissions? Okay, what is it why is that so important? And what is it that worries you the most with respect to this? And how is it that we can actually address this challenge?
So, I mean, the concept of net zero emissions just means that really by 2050, we would want to be neutral in terms of our emissions. So whatever emissions we still have in the economy are being offset by other activities which reduce those emissions. And the reason why that's important is because that's a trajectory that scientists believe is necessary to reduce the most extreme impacts of global warming, right? So if you want to get to a 2-degree scenario, which is talked about a lot, but 1.5 is actually probably more appropriate in terms of reducing those dramatic weather changes. You need to get to a level of net zero emissions by 2050. So we obviously can't wait, for companies to do it in 2045. There needs to be a linear step change over time. And so that's why you need to have 2030 targets. You need to have 2025 targets, and that's what I get worried about with some of the pledges that are being made, because it's become really trendy to pledge, of course, I'm going to be net zero. Well, imagine if you said your family and successors are going to be net zero by 2050. Well, how do you get your head around doing that? What lifestyle changes do you need to make? So
Yeah.
for corporates, they've got a pretty massive footprint in some cases, and it's not going to be easy to change that footprint. To John's point, you need different capital allocation. You need to make different investment decisions, and that's all very challenging. And I think that's that's what gets me a little concerned in terms of just pledging as opposed to action.
Right. Yeah, John, can you just jump in there too? I mean, really, all of this, I'm sure that you have quite a few worries. You see it on a daily basis as you're looking at these companies.
Yeah, I mean, outside of traditional, macroeconomic and market worries, I do worry about the social implications of all this. I don't think leaders are always honest with us of how challenging and complex this change is going to be. And one of the things that we've thought for some time is it's likely to be somewhat inflationary, and we're seeing a lot of that right now.
Yeah.
But the most basic things we need, to power our home, to feed our families, and produce and manage the water that we need, and so on. The investments that are necessary even to keep things the way they are, we've underinvested in the infrastructure for that. But to actually transition to a way of doing it while emitting less harmful GHGs is going to add to some of the costs. And so I worry about our ability to get through this transition to where we need to go without causing social disruption. And I think part of that has to come through more honesty from leaders around. As Martin said, you can make pledges, but you have to be honest with the voting population in democracies anyways about what it's really going to mean to their lives.
And Max, that governance you were talking about is something that we're trying to implement to actually help with that initiative, right?
Right. Yep. To some extent, there are, in terms of the net zero commitments, there are science-based targets which we encourage. And also, I think you've probably heard of carbon footprinting and measuring the portfolio in terms of carbon footprinting. And I think that's certainly, that's an element, but, you're thinking about it more as a rear view mirror. You're thinking about the footprint, the emissions that have occurred. And oftentimes these are years past, they're estimated. And so, what I think is going to happen, or what's going to, evolve over time is kind of future risk thinking. And so by that, it's thinking about, what exposure do I have to physical risks, for instance, in a pathway of severe weather, what are the manufacturing companies and the supply chain exposed to these types of events if we don't get to net zero, right? So, thinking about adaptation is also an element that investors are considering.
So when you think about adaptation, and even just from a personal experiences, I think I've talked to a few of you about this, is that, so I made a commitment to my children that my next car would be electric or at least hybrid. Okay, so I've now started doing some preliminary research, and I wouldn't know nearly as much as all of you. But I'm going to just say to you, first, I can't believe how much more money I'm paying every time I go to the gas pump. It is unbelievable. Even my kids notice. And when I look at the percentage that I'm now paying on my hydro bills every month for my home, the amount it's increased is remarkable. There's no way everyone isn't experiencing the same thing. So that's obviously the inflationary challenges that we're seeing, but also this is a power crunch. Like, it's causing all these energy prices to rise all over the world. So isn't that kind of bad news for consumers? And then now we're paying higher bills for electricity, heating, filling up our cars. It's also detrimental for the environment, which even makes me more anxious. And then you have some countries and states, am I not correct, that they're kind of turning? I've been reading about turning to even old pollution heavy sources like oil and coal, like in places like even China and India. And I know it's a big question, so I'm not asking you to get right into it, but really, I know the answer. Like, please, John, explain to me, like, the answer. It's not to turn back to those old sources, is it? It can't be.
No, I mean, well, as I said, it's very complex, and it's going to take decades to get through the transition. But the really simple answer is we focus so much on the risks associated with this. So many of the solutions to those higher costs that you just talked about actually exist in the types of businesses, the technologies that Martin and we invest in. And, the shift to the electric car, I have a plug-in hybrid, and I find that I can drive it almost entirely on the battery power, and it costs me pennies, it seems, to charge it. So I don't have to fill up anymore. And, we don't have time to go into all of them, but the solutions to these challenges that you're just talking about do exist. And it's going to take a long time to transition, but that's what's so exciting about our space. And that's the offset. And it's really important that we focus on that too, to the worries and the challenges of climate change.
Yeah. So what are some of the alternative fuel sources that maybe that you as an expert have been focused on, that you're interested in? And I just think it's very it's fascinating to me, some of the things that you've talked about. If you don't mind, could you maybe just share with us even some of your findings between a few of the alternative energy sources that you look at?
Sure, and Martin, you can hop in on your side of this, but I mean, we've been from about 2013 on, we've been quite strong supporters of solar, particularly the equipment and some of the materials in solar. We just think it's of the renewable technologies, we think it's the most useful. It has its drawbacks, but it's been growing very quickly. And I think as we combine it with more economic storage in the future. It currently produces about 3%, solar does, of global generation, but we think we can easily get to 15 to 20% around the world of our power source, our electricity source, coming from solar without huge advances in storage. We do have some investments in wind, and we've had some investments in biofuels, but solar to us on the generation side is the most exciting.
Right. Okay, very interesting. Martin, talk to me about what excites you. What do you see that's actually helping the cause?
Well, I mean, to John's point, like we've had investments in the renewable space for upwards of 20 years actually in the fund, and with far before it was something that was broadly considered by the market, because we viewed this as a long transition, and it already started years ago. So
Yeah.
the demand for solar, the demand for wind, especially offshore wind, is just astronomical relative to those net zero commitments. What we need to do actually, and I'm sure John would agree, is you need to kind of make those investments exciting and sexy to people. You can flip Trump's latest deal. That might be super exciting to you. It does absolutely nothing to address any of these issues, right? So we need investors actually to get a little serious about trying to place their capital in the direction that makes a difference for these problems. The EV supply chain is one we've been all over for many, many years. So that's everything from, how you source materials. Like, I mean, if you get off fossil fuels, you got to get a lot of lithium, cobalt, nickel, these other sources. You got to make sure you're getting them in an ethical fashion and an environmentally appropriate fashion. But that's the supply chain that's developing now. That's the one that's critical. It's around, renewables, storage, and delivery of those electrons in transportation, right? And I think tons of opportunity there.
Oh, that's neat. So, really, when you think, I didn't even know. So that you're talking about even the delivery and storage of such. So, why would that make a difference? Is it because there's more of an efficiency? Like, do you have an example for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you talked hybrid or electric vehicles, I mean, you're storing those electrons in a battery and it's being delivered into the car. But
Right.
if you're going to add all that solar or wind into the grid, one of the reasons why the grid in Europe, for instance, was unstable recently is because there wasn't enough nat gas from Russia. You had hydro, which was down, which is a baseload power source, and you had wind that was not blowing as much as it usually does. So you had a whole bunch of things that created a surge in energy prices. If you had more battery storage on the grid, you could deploy the electrons, when you need them over time. So that's what we need to get to pretty quickly, is backing up solar, backing up wind with battery storage. And then you can take your coal down, you can take nat gas down, you can even take nuclear off if you have enough of those other storage solutions.
Yeah. Okay. And really, when I look at the just turning to agriculture and the industry, like, are there innovations that are addressing the challenges that we have there with how it's affected by climate change? Like, John, I'm wondering if you can just comment on that.
Yeah, it's funny because this just how complex this whole challenge is. When you talk about agriculture, it's not the headline technology of batteries or wind or solar technologies, and yet agriculture produces almost a quarter of global emissions if you include forestry in there, or deforestation. But agriculture is a huge source of emissions, and it's a huge challenge to change because we almost have 8 billion people on the planet, and feeding them is very difficult. And I'll just give you one example that's very tied in with the fossil industry. There are three main types of fertilizers that help us grow food: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And one of them, probably the most important one, nitrogen. If you don't have enough nitrogen in your soil, just as an example, in the first year you lose about 40% of your productivity of that soil, and after 2 years you lose about 70%. Wow. So nitrogen is very important, and the majority of nitrogen fertilizer in this world comes through this method of reforming natural gas, and it creates emissions. And so one of the companies we've invested in is called Yara, which is, in some ways a traditional natural gas to nitrogen producer, but they have some really interesting technologies using renewable energy. They've teamed up with a company called Engie in France to use renewable energy to create green ammonia, which is part of the chemical step to creating the nitrogen, which doesn't produce any natural gas. And there are a myriad of other technologies that relate to like precision agriculture, they call it, where you use GPS technologies in the tractors combined with metadata to make sure that you're only using fertilizers when you need them or where you need them. You reduce the amount of fertilizers. You reduce the amount of irrigation using the same type technologies. And, I could go on and on. There's so many technologies related to it, but this is one of the areas where we really need to focus on. And the biggest part of all that, I won't discuss, is getting us off eating meat. A huge chunk of those emissions that we talk about in agriculture come from actually livestock. And this seems strange, but one of the worst gases or most potent greenhouse gases is methane. And a lot of methane, cows produce a lot of methane through burping, actually, not the front end of the cow, not the rear end. And so these are, companies like Beyond Meat and protein replacements and whatnot are other areas that we're looking at.
Yeah, Martin and I have talked about that lots. But what I was going to just mention to you is even one of my daughters, her choice to stop eating beef had to do with exactly that once she understood how much of a contributor negatively to the environment that the farming of cows is and for consumption. And talking now from rural to more urban, Martin, smart cities, like what are they? Maybe it sounds sexier than it is, but it just sounds great to me. But like, what is it to be a smart city? Is Toronto a smart city?
Well, we like to think we're a smart city. No,
Yeah.
I think we're still some decades away from really, using urban planning and technologies to reduce the energy footprint. I mean, Serena, the smartest thing you can do in a city is walk or bike, right?
Yeah.
I mean, while it's great to own a hybrid or electric, the energy that goes into creating those vehicles is pretty intense.
Still.
The lifetime afterwards in terms of, you're not burning things to drive the vehicle, but just getting people on transit, walking or biking is by far the most effective and simplest way to address the energy crisis. That being said, especially with COVID, who wanted to be with anybody else on a subway or a bus, maybe walking or biking? There's more bike lanes now. But that's part of it, right? I mean, we will invest in actually simple technology like bike technology. There's companies like, Shimano that just reported actually had some very good numbers. Giant, which is a manufacturer.
What does that first one do? What does it do?
Shimano actually does the components that you put on the bike, right? So it's the shifting. It's in an e-bike they do the motor for the e-bike.
Yeah.
So it's one of the primary providers of those materials for the manufacturers.
How much of a difference does it make for you as a biker, Martin?
In terms of that technology?
Any of these kinds of technologies?
Yeah, I mean, like if you can't shift a gear, you're not going to be riding your bike. It's essential. This stuff, Shimano is by far the world's largest manufacturer of gears and of the equipment that you have in the drivetrain on the bike. So they're seeing a huge growth now. Actually, post-COVID, one of the most exciting things is people are doing more active outdoor activities. And part of that is cycling. So we love to see that, but it goes into the buildings, it goes into what you're constructing your home with. It goes into what, our new building, we're moving into a new CIBC building there across from Union Station. And that building envelope is going to be significantly more efficient because of the type of glass they're using, because of the HVAC systems, the electrical control systems, the type of, light bulbs they're using. The use of natural light, the air you breathe is going to be better. So all of these things can be introduced into our building codes, and over time will improve, the built environment.
Even things like that matter. I mean, us as advisors and the whole um, uh, client pool out there that does have money to invest. I mean, if you think about it, even those kinds of decisions from a corporate level, that's great. Like understanding that even from a corporate level, you're making a choice to be able to actually participate in a building that's going to be more efficient. I mean, I think that these are the things that are happening that, like, I have heard about more efficient buildings, but I imagine that also would be an area of expertise, Max, that, for you being again in the governance area, there's got to be people from that level that are actually making this happen, because you've got all these people in construction and building, and they realize this is the future. So, hey, let's start getting modernized in the world of what we can do to actually help the cause. Is that right? Or
I think that's fair, Serena. I think gone are the days that you're just looking at the intensive companies like oil and gas or materials and just focusing on their climate risk plans, right?
yeah,
It's broad based, right? It's all sectors, it's all industries. Everybody has to do their part,
it's
and everybody
everywhere.
has to report on that. Exactly. And
Yeah,
so,
and
that's something that we're
actually, if
looking
I
at.
could just make mention, like that would include even the fossil fuel companies, right, Max? Just
Absolutely,
even
yeah, yeah. They're not going anywhere anytime soon, right? I think there is going to be a
no, but
transition. It's going to be choppy, and
right,
so
but is there not going to be some rules of engagement and people are watching? So individuals like you, the initiatives for an oil and gas company to at least do their part in and truly do their part. And if so, like how would that be? Right? As far as the climate change initiative, like would it be that they are trying to produce with cleaner technology,
yeah,
for
I think
example?
it comes down to disclosure as well, right? At the end of the day,
Right,
you want to ensure that the company is saying what they're doing, but also disclosing what they're saying. And
right.
we spoke about those net zero commitments. They're easy to make the commitment, but it's difficult to actually state it. It's going to be 2, 3 CEOs before 2050 arrives,
Right.
right? And so those companies that are making the commitments, we want to see short-term science-based targets that are achievable in order to commit to a net zero by 2050.
Got it. So I don't know if any besides Max, if Martin or John have any final words, but I certainly do with respect to the space. But if either of you want to talk a little bit about these climate solution-based strategies.
Yeah, Serena, I mean,
Martin, you want to go first?
I would just highlight, to John's point, and I mean, we're in complete agreement here. We're looking at opportunities. This is also an exciting way for investors to deploy their capital, get engaged with these issues, and be in alignment, with companies that are really developing some solution to these issues. We don't want to always talk about the risks because sometimes that's daunting. It's also a question of opportunity, and whether that's done from a value perspective in terms of just financial return, or whether it's done from values, what you're interested in and passionate about, either can help in terms of providing stable capital to these companies.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make that point.
No, that's great. John?
Yeah, I just, this may be a little bit inside baseball, but I to just reinforce this idea that it all comes back to capital allocation. For many years, Martin and my business partner, Greg Payne, and myself would meet and have a beer at least once a year, right, Martin? And we would commiserate how little the investment world was actually thinking about these risks, these new risks to the investments they were making, and missing, in our view, the tremendous opportunities that we were seeing. And that's changing, but it hasn't changed enough yet. And so I would actually like to end, Serena. Thank you for actually putting Martin and I together. We've never done this publicly, but we are very much in cahoots trying to highlight to the rest of the investment world that it's no longer really sustainable finance. It's just finance. And that's what Max is getting at too.
Yeah.
This is everything that we do touches almost every business that you invest in, even in the traditional economy. And it's intellectually very interesting, but it's also really important. Like, we have to get more capital to this space. And we both believe the returns are going to be there for those that do.
That's fantastic. It's a great way for you to end on, because my final commentary on this, I'm so passionate about this. And since Martin's days at predecessor firms, one of the reasons why I always followed him is because of the kinds of initiatives he had. At the time, the truth was, I felt badly for him and his colleagues because it didn't seem like there was that big of a pull for him to make money. Sorry, but it was just like, it was just something that seemed a bit frustrating. But I'll tell you, alpha-minded investors, what is that? Somebody who's just more about the potential of growth for you to actually make money. Well, the time is here now. So those kinds of investors, for you to look at spaces like this, and why I'm aligned with John and why I'm aligned with Martin, that is all about making money and being able to optimize your portfolio. We're there now. Also, if you're a socially responsible investor, which I'd like to think that most of my clients have a passion about, I mean, there's no judging. It's not like you have to be one or the other, right? I'm just trying to really make clear to our listeners that really at the end of the day, being socially responsible, this is extremely important. And that's why we had Max here, because I want individuals to know that it's an ever growing area that's going to be further dealt with, so that we can all make sure that we really are aligning ourselves appropriately. And I think for people like Martin and John, it also makes their lives easier when they're making the investments, because I think companies, right, Max, are being forced to actually report. And so at some point, there's got to be a result-driven metrics that's really becoming clear. And finally, policy-driven people. I don't have any shortage of people in the world of politics and their passion for it. And really, at the end of the day, being able to look at where things are going and where then to allocate their own investments. You can look at just the governments out there and the amount of money they're putting into infrastructure right now, globally, in order for us to be able to have those structures for a lot of the initiatives we're talking today. For whatever kind of investor you are, this is an area that you should be paying attention to. But I think that what the gentlemen were all saying is absolutely true. It's not only one specific area, it is going to become just part of investing permanently. And for that, I want to thank everyone. I really, really hope that I can have both of you and Max also on in future to talk about more specific initiatives within the space. But for today, I really appreciate all the time, and thank you for our guests, and most importantly also the people who behind this took the time to actually put things together. You know who you are, but definitely Alicia and Aaron and James, and of course Andrew. So with that, we'll end it. If any questions happen to come up, I'll take them offline and we'll definitely forward them appropriately.